All right, welcome. So on a few weeks ago, I mentioned the Deuteronomic history. That was a history put together by some people, which includes what we now call the book of Deuteronomy, which talked about Moses, escape from slavery, the covenant of Mount Sinai, time in the desert, to make it almost to the promised land. He dies. Next book, Joshua. Joshua is Moses' successor. He takes them into the promised land and they start to settle it. Joshua dies. We've got the 12 tribes and the confederacy, but they're all kind of on their own. They each have local leaders called judges. The book of Judges covers a long period of time under local leadership. Then we have the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, originally one book, but divided in two just because of its length. Samuel is the final judge. The people ask for a king. He appoints Saul as the first king. 1 Samuel ends with the death of Saul. 2 Samuel begins with David replacing Saul and expanding Israel to its largest territorial claims, and that is considered the high point of Jewish history as far as biblical Judaism is concerned. When David dies, he's replaced by Solomon. The first part of his reign continues their good times. He's not in battle because they're the strongest nation. But toward the end, people start getting tired of his policies, his heavy taxes and stuff because of the big forced labor, military, bigger government, and so on. And so when he dies, there's an argument over who's going to succeed him, and the country breaks into two parts. The south maintains the son of Solomon as their king, and he lives in Jerusalem. So they say we're the real successors here because we have a grandson of David on the throne and we've got Jerusalem. The north has more area and more people, but not a successor of David, and the two sides don't get along as well as they used to anymore. And then from then on, it's the decline of Israel. And last week we went over the commentators in 1st and 2nd Kings, gave a quick summary of what each king did during his time. And of all the kings that there were, a few dozen, there were only 3 that were considered to be good and that they followed God solely, and a few others that were okay. Most of the rest they considered to be not very good. They led the people astray by allowing the worship of other gods, some even following those gods themselves, allowing some practices that weren't allowed in Judaism. And at the end, they said that was the reason for the downfall of the country. In 721 or so, the northern half was overtaken. And the people from those tribes were sent around into the other parts of the Assyrian Empire. Sometimes when we talk about Jews of the diaspora, that word means dispersed. They were dispersed in other areas. Last week we asked, it's 10 tribes in the north, so sometimes they refer to those as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because the northern tribes were called Israel. The south was called Judah. Judah was not overtaken in 721. Isaiah advises the king, Hezekiah, and says, we'll survive. And they do. They have an underground water tunnel that supplies water for the city. And then some kind of plague starts affecting the Assyrians, and they leave. And when they go back home, their king is assassinated, and his successor doesn't follow up on the siege of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is saved for a while, but then, further kings aren't very good. There's one good one. Josiah tries to make some reforms, but it's too late, and his successors aren't very good, and eventually Babylon, which in the meantime has overtaken Assyria, as the opposing empire comes in, and we finished the 2nd book of Kings with the destruction of Judah, and the remaining peoples, most of them being exiled to Babylon, which is modern Iraq. So that is the low point of Jewish history, the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the kingdom. So that is a very brief history of Israel, or Israel and Judah. So tonight we're going to just very briefly do 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you'll see why it's brief, because it's going to cover pretty much the same things as 1st and 2nd Kings. Just a little bit different. We believe that the author wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, those 4 books. They originally, I think, were all one. And Chronicles, just like Samuel, just like Kings, called 1st and 2nd because it was a long book and they simply divided it in half. The only thing is, in Chronicles, the author goes all the way back and tries to go all the way back to Adam. So there's all those names in chapter 1 to try to say, all right, we'll go all the way back to the beginning. And then from Abraham to Jacob, and then chapter 2, Judah, and then chapter 3 and 4, more names. We start getting the list of the 12 tribes and all the families that are there. Through chapter 7, more of the 12 tribes. So finally, when we get to the end of chapter 9, we finally get to Saul and David. All right, and then it talks there about the death of Saul, at the end of chapter 10, or at the beginning of chapter 10, how David becomes king in chapter 11. Remember, in Kings, it talked about David's war heroes, okay, so they're listed here again in chapter 11. It talks about how his earlier leaders tonight, when they gave the summary of David in the reading that we just had in church, it said, when Saul died, right, and it said he had the first 7 years in Hebron and then 33 in Jerusalem. So here it says, midway of chapter 12, the time in Hebron. Chapter 13, when they transferred the ark to Jerusalem. We talked about that, and David celebrated with it. His wife didn't think much of that. Okay, so they bring it to Jerusalem, and now in chapter 14, David makes his capital in Jerusalem, and that's where he lived for his last 33 years. Philistine wars, the Philistines were their main enemy. David had success against them, and because of that, in chapter 15, he has his palace in Jerusalem, and he brings the ark there, and they'll eventually build a place for the ark. Chapter 17 is the story of Nathan telling David that you won't be the one who builds the ark, a place for the ark, but your son will. Chapter 18, more victories of David. Chapter 19 is the same thing, 20. So more exploits of Israel during their peak. Chapter 21, when they shouldn't have taken the census and what happened for that. 22, information about the temple and instructions for Solomon, the successor of David. 23, some information about the Levites in the next chapter, priestly class, what they're supposed to do. A chapter for singers, a chapter for gatekeepers and treasurers. Next one, army commanders, tribal heads, overseers. So things that all these people are supposed to do. And just like 1 Kings ended with the death of Saul, here 1 Chronicles ends with the death of David. Okay, so 2 Chronicles starts off with the reign of Solomon. And in chapter 3, 4, 5, it's building the temple. Remember all the workers he had to have come in to do that and how long it took. Chapter 6, the prayer he does. And chapter 7, the dedication for the temple. So they get that finished. And then Solomon dies at the end of chapter 9. Then chapter 10 begins with the division. Right, the argument over who his successor should be. Okay, we have the north, now called Israel, and the south called Judah. And these remaining chapters will talk about these different leaders. So Rehoboam, chapter 11, is Solomon's son. Chapter 13, Abijam, Jeroboam, people in the south, and then all these other people are future kings. Chapter 14, remember Asa was one of the good kings, Asa the reformer. You see other names of other kings. End of chapter 18, remember Ahab was one of the bad kings. He was married to Jezebel, so they talk about his death again in chapter 18. Okay, and more kings. Chapters. And we keep looking at the headings, tell you about who these kings are and what's going on. Chapter 28, we get some reforms under Hezekiah and Josiah. So those were the other two good kings. And by reforms, it's trying to get people back to the original practice of the faith. By the time we get to chapter 32, it talks about the invasion of Sennacherib. He was the king of Assyria. He came in and took over Israel, the north. At the end of chapter 32, though, is when they're not successful in capturing Jerusalem. So it says, and that's during Hezekiah's time. So the south remained safe for a little while. However, chapter 33, his son Manasseh is even worse. Things decline, get much worse. Another one. Then they get Josiah, who's the last good one in chapter 34. He makes some reforms, but it's too late. End of chapter 34 is when they're at the temple and somebody finds this book, which has the law in it. And they say, yeah, we have not been following this, so we're in trouble. And then in chapter 36 is the story of the end. Those names are the final kings, which we talked about last week. And then chapter 36, verses 15 through 21 are the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So Chronicles covers many of the same events as 1 and 2 Kings. In the Jewish Bible, they put Chronicles behind Ezra and Nehemiah, which chronologically doesn't seem to make much sense, but the reason for it is they want to end on a happy note. So remember, the author put the first paragraph of Ezra and added it as the last paragraph of 2nd Chronicles, saying that, okay, after all these bad things happened, about 48 years later or so, we have a new kingdom. So the Babylonians, who were so bad to us, they get overtaken by Persia. Persians are a lot nicer to us. They tell us that we can go back to our land. So they end with the return in 2nd Chronicles instead of just the destruction. So we as Christians, during Advent, all the Old Testament readings are written during that time of that exile. Because during that time they write so many things about how they want to go back home, they're looking forward to that day. So we use those readings to show that we're looking forward to the return of the Messiah. All right, what were things like? How about, let's take a look at the book of Lamentations. Look in the table of contents and see what page that's on. In a little bit, you'll see why I'm quickly going to do that one. What lamentation means?
Right.
Yes, sad. So for those of you who are in music, a canticle is a happy song. A lamentation is a sad song. Yes, we do.
Country western.
Yeah. All right, 3 books of the Old Testament are songs. Okay, you probably would say, yep, we know the book of Psalms is a book of songs. We sing that in between the first and second readings in church on Sunday. The other 2 are Song of Songs, which is some happy songs about young love, and Lamentations. So if you take a look at Lamentations, you will see that there are 5. And by the way they're written, what do you notice by just the words on the page? Yeah, they're written as poetically rather than as a story. So those are 5 sad songs about the fall of Jerusalem. So you can just take a look at the first one, if you can imagine this being in song or a sad story being told. How lonely she is now, the once crowded city. Jerusalem used to be very crowded. We were happy here. We had all these people, now look how lonely it is. Widowed is she, who was mistress over nations. Yeah, we were very powerful. Now it's like she's a widow. People are gone. The princess among the provinces has been made a toiling slave. Yeah, because we're exiled in Babylon. So you can read through any of those 5 if you want between now and next time. But if you read Lamentations now, they should all make sense. Simply because you know the setting. The sad songs written after the destruction of Jerusalem, during the exile from Jerusalem. So Lamentations, pretty easy book to summarize.
That was all about 50 years.
Yeah, from 586 to 538, so about 48 years. Okay? And I said I was going to ask you to tell me what 2 Psalms meant. See if you can figure these out. So go to book of Psalms and go to Psalm 80. And these two, just ask me to see if you can figure out what they mean. Again, so these are songs. And you can even see there are 20 verses. And by the way, the book of Psalms is 150 separate songs. So that means that book you don't have to read in order, because one song isn't related to another. It's 150 separate songs, whereas the other books are usually you read chapter by chapter. All right, and you see there's a total of 20 verses in Psalm 80. And they're also divided, though, into 1, 2, and 3. So it's like verse 1, 2, and 3 of the song. And usually at the beginning, they even say what it's about. And it says for the leader and how maybe a little bit about who they think wrote it. Sometimes they even list what instruments are used to play it. All right, the first verse there, which is verse 2, 3, and 4, is saying, Shepherd of Israel, listen. Okay, so the first part there is asking God, listen to this song now. And what we ask for. So, I want you to skim through verses 5 through 20 and see if you can tell me what that psalm is about.
Psalms were written during David's time, weren't they?
Psalms were written over many centuries. Remember, there's 150 of them unrelated to one another. So some of them go way back, and some aren't written until later on.
Well, the vine must be referring to the Israelite people.
That is correct.
Because it says it brought them out of Egypt.
Yes. Yeah. So it's an allegory about Israel. So, beginning in the second part, which is verse 5, the song said, Lord of hosts, O God, how long will you burn with anger while your people pray? So you must be mad at us because our city was destroyed and we're exiled. Now we're praying, hoping things will get better. Are you going to listen or not? You fed us with a bread of tears. Yeah, our tears. You've left us to be fought over by our neighbors, and our enemies make fun of us. So restore us, bring us back. Let your face shine on us so that we can be saved. And then that next verse, you brought a vine out of Egypt. So basically now this last part is a quick history of the people in the form of a parable of a song, or an allegory of a song. You brought a vine out of Egypt. That vine was us, our ancestors. We were in Egypt. You brought us out. You drove away other people and planted us. You led us into this land that we call the Holy Land. You cleared it for us. So we're the vine that took root and filled. We had children. They lived here. The mountains were covered with its shadow. So yeah, we were numerous. We had lots of people here. Its boughs went out as far as the sea. And we can tell you what that means. But then, in verse 13, why have you broken down the walls so that all who pass by pluck its fruit? So, yeah. Now people just come by and do what they want here because we're so weak. The boar from the forest strips the vine. The beasts feed upon it. So look down upon us and see. Attend to our vine. And those who burned it down, may they perish at your rebuke. And it concludes with, restore us, let your face shine upon us that we may be saved. So Psalm 80 is simply a song which says, basically a quick summary, we were in Egypt, you brought us here, you made us strong, and now things are terrible. Are you going to help us to make things better? Simple song to God about the plight during the exile. All right? How many people knew that?
Never put your hand up.
Well, one did. But again, that's why I always say the context, you're able to figure it out. But based on these things we've talked about recently, hopefully, especially after I explained that made sense to you. It gives you the meaning of the song. You can do that with lots of songs. You know, if you find out what the author's original intent was, but you can do that with modern music as well. Okay? Another one, very well-known one, is 137. So let's take a look at Psalm 137.
A lot of the liturgy of the hours was, Father?
Yes, that was regularly used, although you'll see not all of it. You will
Right.
pretty soon.
Right.
And once a year, we do Psalm 137. It's the psalm in between the first and second readings. And on that Sunday, I often do a homily or explain the psalm. Most times I don't, but if we do 137, I often do. Can anybody explain that one? Well, the heading gives you the setting. Mine does anyway. What does it say? Mine says sorrow and hope and exile. So this one's written during the exile too. Just like Lamentations, those 5 sad songs are written during the exile. Psalm 80, we just did, written during the exile. Things are so bad. Okay, Psalm 37. So by the rivers of Babylon. I think there's even a song like that. Yes. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat mourning and weeping. All right, so if we want to analyze this, what are the rivers of Babylon? And Babylon is modern Iraq, so if you look on a map, what are the 2 main rivers over there, which you studied when you first started learning world history when you were in 5th grade or whatever? Tigris and Euphrates. Okay, so go way back to that. Okay, we're by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers over in Babylon. We sat weeping, mourning and weeping. Why are we mourning and weeping? Because we're in Babylon, not in Israel, we lost our home. And we sat weeping when we remembered Zion. Remember, Zion is the hill that Jerusalem is built on. So we're thinking of home and we're crying because we're so sad. We're not there anymore, and we can't go back. On the paupers of that land, and then there's an asterisk there because it's not sure what type of tree they're referring to, but it doesn't matter too much. It says, we hung up our harps on the trees. Why would we hang up our harps? Yes, a harp is a happy instrument. You play it when you're happy. So we're certainly not happy, so we don't have any use for the harps. Our captors ask us for the words of a song. Our tormentors basically made fun of us, saying, sing for us a song of Zion. So our captors are making fun of us, saying, hey, why don't you sing a song of your homeland? And we conclude that verse by saying, how could we sing a song of the Lord when we're in a foreign land? There's no time for happy songs here because we're hundreds of miles from home. So then the next verse. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand wither. Well, you certainly don't want your right hand to wither, but you can say that with confidence because you know there's no way I'm ever going to forget Jerusalem. No matter how long I'm in exile, I'm not going to forget Jerusalem. So I can say, may my right hand wither if I forget Jerusalem. May my tongue stick to my palate if I don't remember it. Okay? Not a problem because I'm not going to forget it. So I can say, I won't be able to speak if I forget it. If I don't exalt Jerusalem above all my delights, I'll never forget Jerusalem no matter what. So that is what we have in the Liturgy of the Hours when we do Psalm 137. And that is what we sing in church when we do Psalm 137. And I don't know if any of you read ahead and you wonder, why don't we do the last verse? And the answer is because Jesus wouldn't approve of that verse probably, as Christians. Yeah. So remember, so this is Jewish thought at the time. We're very big into revenge of enemies. So we as Christians just don't sing that verse because we would follow along with that. But yes, the third verse seeks revenge. And by the way, when it says, remember against Edom that day at Jerusalem, Edom is the neighboring country to the south. And if you go back, there's supposedly that's the the descendants of Esau, the brother of Isaac. So they're not us, but they should be friends with us. But that day when Jerusalem was destroyed, what did they do instead of helping us? They said, yeah, level it down to its foundations. So we don't think much of Edom. And then Babylon, you destroyer, you that destroyed us, yeah, we hope somebody does the same to you someday. And that mean remark about children means, we hope we don't have any descendants. So that is an explanation of Psalm 137, and why in church we sing the first 2/3 and not the last. All right?
Are the entrance antiphons at Mass, are they kind of a compilation of different material? I mean, not a direct quote out of being part of the Bible?
They find a scripture passage that's suitable for the day. So like today, there were ones that related to a missionary, like Ansgar or Blaze. So yeah, it's just one you choose for a little. So the Anders Antiphon is like a one-line song, just something you can say to start out. All right, and then the easiest book of the Bible to do probably is Obadiah, one of the prophets. So I'm going to go ahead and do Obadiah quickly because of this time. It is one of the few prophets whose words are not addressed to Israel or Judah. They're addressed to an enemy nation. And you'll notice how long is the book of Obadiah. How many chapters?
1.
Yeah, how many verses?
21.
Yeah, just 21 verses. So pretty easy to do Obadiah because it's just 21 verses. And most of the prophets, which we'll do later, but it just starts off with the vision of Obadiah, or thus says the Lord, here's something I've got. But anyway, in verse 2, he's addressing Edom, that little nation to the south. I will make you small among nations. You are held in dire contempt.
Amos.
Yeah, after Amos. Yep, you gotta know the page, otherwise you'll miss it because it's just a page or two. All right, so what's Obadiah about? Well, verses 10 and 11 pretty well tell you that. Prophets many times gave oracles against people. They said, here's something you did that God is very much unhappy about. So in the case of Obadiah, he's speaking to Edom, the group to the south. And in verse 10, he says, why is God upset? Because of violence to your brother Jacob. Okay. You participated in this. You participated in the collapse of Jerusalem. You should have been helping instead. So now disgrace shall cover you, and you shall be destroyed. And why? Because on that day, on the day when you stood by, on the day when aliens carried off his possessions and entered the gates and cast lots over Jerusalem, you too were one of them. So instead of helping, you participated in the destruction of Jerusalem. So Obadiah is simply an oracle against Edom for not helping Jerusalem, but instead participating in its destruction. Most prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, theirs covers like 40 years. Obadiah, just one simple oracle against people for not helping. So a very easy one to explain. Okay, make sense? Any questions on Psalm 80 or 137 or Obadiah? Did you eventually find it? And the reason I did those is those were written during the exile. Those are examples of things that were written during the exile. Many other things were too, but you can see the setting makes it so those passages make sense. if someone didn't know any of the history of it, you read Psalm 180, or Psalm 80, or 137, or Obadiah, you'd say, yeah, I don't really know what that's about. But hopefully this makes it so that you do. So with that, we will go to Ezra. As I said earlier, if you look at the list of the books in the Hebrew Bible, these are the last four. Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1 and 2 Chronicles, because they wanted to end with the happy paragraph at the end of 2nd Chronicles. But obviously, 1st and 2nd Chronicles happened before Ezra and Nehemiah. And Ezra and Nehemiah probably happened around the same time, and they are the two main characters in the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So, as I mentioned at the very end of last week, the first paragraph of Ezra is the same as the last paragraph of 2nd Chronicles. It says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, hey, we all know when that is now. Okay, sometimes we said we're within, at the beginning, it's like maybe within 50 years. Then like the destruction of Jerusalem, we're within 1 year. Now we know exactly. It's 538. 538 BC is when Cyrus came to power in Persia. Okay, so in that year, things are going to get better. All right, so they get this decree. Yeah, that's my phone.
Oh, for some you need to go answer.
Yeah, because they just called the
Yeah,
church phone.
Church phone rang too.
Okay, I'm gonna shut that off quick. I'll go check the phone.
Might be something. Something else.